Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive? We got a listener request to take a closer look at French bulldogs, pugs, and British bulldogs. You know, those brachycephalic breeds.
The flat-faced pups. Always popular.
Yep. And our listener sent in some fascinating research on congenital vertebral malformations, CVMs. Specifically, how common they are in these breeds.
Oh, yeah, I saw that study from the Australian Veterinary Journal, right. They looked at a huge number of dogs, which is pretty awesome. Gives us a much clearer picture than some smaller studies.
It does. So let's jump right in now. Congenital vertebral malformations. That sounds kind of scary.
It can be, yeah.
How common are we talking here? Like, should every brachycephalic owner be worried?
Well, let's just say the numbers were higher than I expected. They found that almost all the French and British bulldogs in the study had at least one malformed vertebra.
Whoa, really? Like, how high are we talking?
We're talking 96.82% of French bulldogs and 90.47% of British bulldogs. Even pugs, which had the lowest prevalence, were still over 76%.
Wow. So chances are, if you see one of these breeds out and about, they've got at least one CVM. But wait, the article mentioned these dogs were all neurologically normal.
Right. They weren't showing any symptoms of neurological problems, so that makes you wonder, how many more dogs out there have CVMs but haven't been diagnosed because they're not showing signs yet?
Yeah, that's a good point. So, okay, we know almost all these dogs have at least one malformed vertebra. But what exactly does a malformed vertebra look like?
Good question. The researchers used something called the Modified McMaster classification scheme to categorize all the different malformations they found.
Modified McMaster. Sounds complicated.
It's not as bad as it sounds. Basically, there are 8 types of malformations, and they all describe how the vertebra is shaped or, misshapen.
8 different types. Are some more common than others?
Absolutely. The most common one, especially in French and British bulldogs, is called ventral hypoplasia. Basically, the front part of the vertebra is underdeveloped, like it's wedge-shaped instead of a nice solid block.
Ah, okay, I can picture that. Kind of like a wedge of cheese instead of a Lego brick. No wonder it could cause problems. What about the other types? Any that stand out?
Well, another common one is symmetrical hypoplasia. In this case, the vertebra is just shorter than it should be, but it's symmetrical.
So it's like a vertebra that got squished.
Yeah, exactly. And get this. The researchers actually found 3 vertebrae they couldn't classify using the system at all.
Whoa, seriously? Vertebrae is so weird, they don't even fit the existing categories.
Yep. Shows you how much we still have to learn, right?
Definitely. So we've got these malformations. They come in all these different shapes. But where exactly in the spine are they happening?
Another good question. Turns out some areas are more prone to these malformations than others. In French and British bulldogs, it's usually vertebrae T5 to T10 that are affected.
Okay, so right in the middle of the back, in the chest region. What about pugs? Any differences there?
Actually, yeah. For pugs, the most commonly affected vertebrae are slightly higher up, from T6 to T9.
Interesting. So even though the exact location might differ a little between breeds, it seems like this is a problem across all these brachycephalic screwtail breeds.
Absolutely. And, there's still so much more to unpack here, like the connection between these CVMs and the screwtail itself.
I know, right? This is getting super interesting. I think we need to give our listeners a minute to digest all this before we go any further, though.
All right, ready to dive back in?
Oh, absolutely. We've learned these malformations are surprisingly common. We've seen the different shapes. But what does it all mean for the dogs? If they're not showing symptoms, is it really a big deal?
That's the million-dollar question, and that's why this research is so important. Just because the dogs in this study were neurologically normal,
right,
doesn't mean those malformed vertebrae can't cause problems down the line.
Okay, so they're not always benign. What kind of problems can they cause?
Well, for one, vets look out for something called kyphosis.
Kyphosis. Okay, that sounds a little intimidating.
It's basically an excessive curvature of the spine. You might hear it called hunchback. In severe cases, this curvature can actually put pressure on the spinal cord.
Ouch, yeah. That sounds like something you'd want to avoid. Any other red flags to watch out for?
Definitely. Another one is a vertebral step. Basically, 2 vertebrae next to each other don't line up properly, creating a step-like deformity.
So like a bump in the road, but in the dog's spine.
Exactly. And just like a bump in the road can cause problems for a car, a vertebral step can lead to instability and pain in the dog's back. And remember, these dogs often have multiple malformed vertebrae.
Right.
The study found that 97% of French bulldogs with CVMs had more than one.
97%. So we're not just talking about one misaligned vertebra. We're talking about multiple bumps in the road, so to speak. What does that do to their overall spinal health?
Such a good question. And it highlights why more research is so important. If so many of these dogs have multiple malformed vertebrae, I mean, it really makes you think about their long-term health, right? Even if a dog doesn't have noticeable symptoms like kyphosis or a vertebral step, just having these CVMs might make them more likely to develop other spinal issues down the road.
Okay, so even if they seem fine now, it's almost like a ticking time bomb. What other kinds of spinal issues are we talking about?
Well, think about it. If the vertebrae aren't formed correctly, it can affect the alignment and stability of the whole spine, and that can put extra stress on the discs between the vertebrae.
You're talking about intervertebral disc disease.
Exactly, IVDD. It's a common problem in dogs, and it can cause all sorts of problems, from mild back pain to, in severe cases, even paralysis.
Man, this is painting a pretty concerning picture. I love these breeds, but knowing how common these spinal issues are, it's kind of disheartening.
I get it. It's tough to hear. But knowledge is power, right? The more we understand about these potential risks, the better decisions we can make for our furry friends.
So what does all this mean for someone who owns or is thinking about owning one of these breeds? What can they do?
Well, first and foremost, be aware. If you're thinking about getting one of these breeds, talk to your vet about CVMs. Find out what to look for, what you can do to help prevent problems. And if you already have one of these dogs, pay close attention to how they're moving.
What kind of things should we be watching for?
Any signs of back pain, stiffness, trouble moving, changes in their gait, like if they're suddenly hesitant to jump on the couch or seem stiff when they get up, those could be warning signs.
So we need to be proactive. Don't just assume everything's fine because they're not showing obvious symptoms.
Exactly. Early detection is key. If you notice anything off, get them checked out by a vet. Early intervention can make a huge difference.
This is all really important info. Definitely makes me think more carefully about these breeds and about responsible breeding practices.
Absolutely. And speaking of responsible breeding, that brings us to a big question. If CVMs are this common, what are the ethical implications of breeding these dogs at all? It's a tough conversation, but it's one we need to have.
Definitely. It's a topic that deserves a lot of thought. Sounds like we're ready for the final part of our deep dive. All right, so here we are, the final part of our CVM deep dive. We've talked about how common they are. We've seen the different forms they can take.
And now the big question.
The ethics of it all. Knowing just how prevalent CVMs are in these breeds, can we ethically justify breeding them?
Yeah, it's a tough one. This study found almost every single dog they looked at had least one malformed vertebra, even if they weren't showing symptoms.
And we know those malformations can cause problems, pain, mobility issues, even serious neurological stuff down the line. It really makes you think, doesn't it, about what we're prioritizing when we breed these dogs.
It does. And, you know, we even talked about how the screw tail itself, that cute curly tail, is actually caused by CVMs, just in the tail vertebrae.
Right. So it makes you wonder, if we keep breeding for that trait, are we making the problem worse in other parts of the spine too?
Exactly. It's like we've been focusing on looks without really thinking about the consequences for the dogs.
So what do we do? Do we just stop breeding these brachycephalic screwtail breeds altogether?
Well, some people think that's the only ethical option. They argue it's wrong to keep breeding dogs that are basically guaranteed to have health problems.
And I can see their point. These dogs didn't choose to have these predispositions. We, as humans, kind of created them.
Right, through selective breeding. We wanted those flat faces, those curly tails, and in doing so, we might have accidentally made them more prone to these problems.
But on the other hand, some people argue that with responsible breeding practices, we can reduce these problems. We can still enjoy these breeds, but in a more ethical way.
Yeah, and there are breeders out there working hard to do that. They're doing genetic testing, being super careful about which dogs they breed, really trying to prioritize health.
So it's not about saying no to these breeds entirely. It's about changing how we breed them.
Exactly. It's about shifting the focus from looks to overall health and well-being, and making sure potential owners really understand the risks involved.
It's a big shift in mindset, but I think it's an important one. We're talking about living, breathing dogs here, not just a fashion statement.
Couldn't have said it better myself. At the end of the day, it's about making informed decisions, decisions that put the dog's well-being first. This research gives us a lot to think about, and hopefully it'll spark some important conversations about responsible breeding.
This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening. I know we covered a lot of complex info, but I think the main takeaway is awareness. The more we understand these issues, the better we can advocate for these breeds.
Absolutely. From Vet NeuroJar, keep those minds inspired, hearts light, and tails wagging.